Now, Israel's President Isaac Herzog has announced that he will invite Benjamin Netanyahu to form Israel's next government, paving the way for him to take the country's top job for a record 6th time and extend his record as the nation's longest-serving leader. Herzog says he will officially issue the mandate to Netanyahu on Sunday. The announcement comes after meeting with all the factions in parliament, the Knesset, to ask who they would back for prime minister. Mr. Herzog will meet with Netanyahu at the president's residence on Sunday to formally give him the mandate under Israeli law. Netanyahu will then have 28 days to form a new government with the possibility of a 14-day extension if required. Taiwan is expected to top the agenda when U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping meet next week, their first in-person encounter since Mr. Biden took office in 2020. The much-awaited meeting comes at a time when relations between the two superpowers have particularly soared, fueled by Beijing's claims over self-ruled Taiwan and its increasing assertiveness in Asia. The U.S. has responded by restricting access to computer chip technology, which has hit China's export-driven economy, which uses the tech to make and sell everything from phones to electric cars. Given the recent spike in tensions and rhetoric, the world and America's Asian allies, such as India, Japan and Australia, will be closely watching the meeting schedule to take place on Monday in Bali ahead of the G20 summit. In the meantime, the United States will be briefing Taiwan on the results of the meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The White House National Security Advisor told reporters the U.S. aim is to make Taiwan feel secure and comfortable about the United States' support. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden will be discussing with his South Korean counterpart, Yoon Suk-yeol, the broader threat posed by North Korea in the cyber domain during an upcoming trip to Asia. According to U.S. National Security Advisor, Washington remains concerned about the possibility of North Korea conducting another nuclear test. President Joe Biden will meet Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol during the upcoming trip to Asia to discuss how to stem North Korea's nuclear program.
Well, we've been very transparent about our concern that North Korea, that the DPRK would conduct its 7th nuclear test at some point in this broader time frame. And by broader, I mean we've been talking about this now for a couple of months. That window still remains open. Our concern still remains real. Whether it happens in the next week or not, I can't say. We are also concerned about further potential long-range missile tests in addition to the possibility of a nuclear test. And so we'll be watching carefully for both of those. We are in very tight coordination with both the ROK and Japan, and the trilateral meeting that the three leaders will be able to have on the margins of the East Asia Summit, I think will be a significant milestone.
Joining us to talk more about that visit with the president in Asia is Washington correspondent Maria Bird. Hi, Maria. Good to see you. Talk to us about that, the expectations from that visit to Asia by the president.
The expectations are, we know the past months we've had over in Asia serious issues, whether it was between the U.S. and China, and so the president is ready and we're have further discussions with China. We know that we have all types of tactical a period of economic post-COVID, and so it's really time to re-engage with China. I think the president understands that that re-engagement is going to be critical for the movement of the U.S.-Chinese relations, but also for the global economy as well. The U.S. and China have always been one of the largest trade partners, and currently at this time, because of some of the tension between the two countries, that has been quite a bit of a challenge.
mix of Taiwan there. We know China's position with regards to Taiwan, but then what about the U.S. presidency? And this is also as it differs from, Congress and what we saw the U.S. speaker do during her visit to Taiwan and the ruckus that caused.
Yes, the U.S. president going over and visiting, I think, is another diplomatic move by the U.S. Obviously, the White House was not necessarily in favor when the Speaker of the House did not speak out against it, but that was not their recommendation for her to go over to at that time. We know that the U.S. has still had a very strong stance on the humanity issues that exist between Taiwan and China, and have been a supporter of the Taiwanese people, especially as it relates to human rights violations that could be occurring. And so I think the U.S. will continue to stand firm on those issues. But I think some of the issues around climate change, where the U.S. is claiming, and the president is now becoming even more outspoken, saying the U.S. will continue to be a leader in climate change issues, and the infrastructure bill that he put forward and all the plan that he has around infrastructure is really going to address some climate change issues globally. I think those are some of the key areas that he will begin to discuss. And I think that he knows that time is now. As you mentioned, South Korea is another ally of the U.S. We know there has been communication over the years since the former President Trump's administration with North Korea. And so the continent of Asia is one that I think this administration knows that they must begin to work with, and they must begin to open those relations even more than they have been over the recent years.
Come to his message at COP27 later, but still staying with the upcoming trip to Asia, North Korea is also another issue, and we understand that he will be discussing with his South Korean counterpart as to the broader threat that North Korea poses. Do we have an idea of what that decision would be?
Nuclear testing is always a major concern for the U.S. And I think the question now is going to be what is going to be next, and where does North Korea and South Korea sit with their relations, and kind of what South Korea is advising the U.S. in that area. I think that region is one that has been kind of in the background for the U.S. and focal point, but we also know that North Korea has become even more vocal, and we are in times of of war with Ukraine and Russia, and so it's just very important that the U.S. understands the strategic plans as it relates to North Korea to ensure that no further conflicts will arise in that region.
Let's talk about the United States president, headed to Egypt. What will be the message there? Lots of leaders have spoken about, COP27, the effect of climate change, and how some countries in Africa are saying reparations and damages should be paid to them.
Yes, and I think that that's what the president is hoping to be able to continue the message with. I think that all the movement in the U.S. around the infrastructure bill, around what it's going to take to really re-engage and reignite the U.S. infrastructure, is really around climate change. The U.S. is very aware of its role and what is happening with global climate devastation in many areas. The U.S. is experiencing it in the midst of hurricanes happening at a rate that we've never seen before, wildfires in Northern California areas. And so the U.S. has experienced quite a bit of challenges as it relates to climate change. The only issue that the U.S. must begin to tackle is how can they begin to walk away from some of the use of emissions that have been part of the American tradition now and lifestyle for decades. And so how do they move back from those? And I think the U.S. is very clear that some of the immediate needs for climate change cannot be addressed in the U.S. and they must be addressed globally, and the U.S. will begin to catch up in that area. But I think the president is hopeful to be a leader in the conversation and to see how the U.S. can best participate and be an active participant in helping to address the climate change issues.
And we understand that just a few minutes ago, he was heckled during his speech by protesters towards the end of his climate speech. It was said that a group of protesters holding a banner were heard to make noise when he declared the U.S. as world leader. We understand they were quickly escorted out of the hall as he continued his address. But in terms of, the promises from the United States towards climate change, what are those, structural measures that they will be taking?
Well, one of the main areas that the U.S. is going to be taking is how and which fuel. Fossil fuel will be something that will be addressed, how in which we use emissions with cars. I mean, there have been goals set forth, especially you look at the state of California, has various goals around reducing the amount of carbon emissions in the air from cars. And so the U.S. has a goal to be able to reduce the number of gas cars in the U.S. By the time we're seeing within the next generation, hopefully being fully electric. There is also, areas around being able to coal mining and how we're going to begin to address some of those issues around emissions and carbon that are released. And so that is some of those core, when you talk about the infrastructure bill and the plan that the president has, those are some of the areas that are outlined there as to how to reduce the dependency on fuel and on fossils and on coal and on these things that emit all types of carbon into the atmosphere.
And that emissions target is 2030. Maria, thanks for that update.
Thank you.
Let's head now to the U.S. midterm elections. Days after Americans went to the polls, the political world remains on tenterhooks, with both chambers of the U.S. Congress up for grabs as election officials painstakingly tally hundreds of thousands of votes in a process that could take days, weeks, some say, to resolve. Officials in Arizona, where a key Senate race is still undecided, said that counting will go on until next week. The fate of the Senate rests with a trio of fiercely contested states. Either party can win a majority by sweeping the races in Nevada and Arizona. If those races don't deliver a majority for either party, Senate control will be decided in a runoff election in Georgia for the second time in 2 years.
We're not going to, anywhere from 60 to 80 perhaps will be released every day. You guys can do the math. And we have 400 to 410,000. We'll be mostly done by early next week. And then, of course, Mr. Richard talked about the curing process. By state law, people have until Wednesday to cure any signature that's still questionable out there. So that's a small, tiny percentage of the total number of voters that will vote in this election. But yeah, that's when we'll get closer.
We have counted all the votes for people who actually showed up on Election Day and put a ballot into the tabulator. We have about 17,000 left from Election Day. These were the ones that were not read by the tabulator and were put into door 3. We're starting on that tabulation now on that 17,000. Again, that is part of the full 400 to 410,000 amount. We anticipated 95 to 99% of the ballots to be counted by Friday. That's tomorrow. But I'm here to tell you the goalposts have changed. All right. And the reason that the goalposts have changed is because wonderful news, the great participation we had on Election Day. And in particular, we had 290,000 mail-in ballots dropped off at our vote centers on Election Day. That broke the previous record by 70%.
Additionally, there are 15,000 ballots that are currently in curing status. This is for ballot packets that we have originally marked to be a non-matching signature or no signature. We are in the process of attempting to cure as many of those as possible. We have up until 5 business days after Tuesday Election Day to contact the voter through any means possible, through mail, through phone call, through text, through email, to determine if it was indeed the voter who sent in that ballot.
Republican U.S. Senate candidate Herschel Walker has been rallying supporters in Canton, Georgia, the day after a decisive runoff election was confirmed for the 6th of December. The Trump-backed former college football star will again face off against Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, as both of them failed to clear the 50% threshold needed to win in the first round of midterm elections held on Tuesday.
We cannot continue to do this. I want everyone to call a friend and tell your friend to get out and vote. Tell your friend you got to go out and vote. Do not sit on the sideline no more. Because if we sit on the sideline, we will not recognize this country again. They want to change everything about this country. They want to change it. We don't want to have Kamala Harris making decisions for us. Kamala Harris making decisions for us. We don't even want to have Senator Warnock making any more decisions for us. Anytime else to end this, and the way you end it, by putting Herschel Walker as your senator. And he's a follower. He's a follower to vote for Joe Biden 96% of the time. He either following Joe Biden or he has no clue of what he's doing. So he's deciding what he wants. Follow Joe Biden or don't know what the heck he's doing. So that's the reason he needs to leave that office. Because he's voted, they make it harder on us. When we get to the point that we can get this green agenda.
In the meantime, Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock is firing his supporters up for his upcoming runoff race against opponent. We just saw Herschel Walker telling them that the future of America is at stake in the election. Neither Warnock nor the Republican Walker reached that 50% in the Senate race in the November 2008 midterm election, forcing them into a one-on-one ahead of December 6th.
I'm going to need you to stick with me for 4 more weeks. Can we do that? Because we've got some unfinished business. This is about who we are as Georgians. And Georgians understand the importance of competence and character. This is not a race about Democrat and Republican. It's not a race of right versus the left. Fundamentally, this is a race about right and wrong. Who's right for Georgia? And who's clearly wrong for Georgia? It also requires an awareness of the challenges facing Georgians and a willingness and ability to work with them to address them. Herschel Walker has shown us that he's not capable. He's not ready to do any of that. In fact, he's shown us that he's not really interested in doing any of that. Herschel Walker has no vision for our state or for our country. Think about it. We've been running now for a little while. And he has yet to tell us what he actually wants to do.
Well, joining me now is VOA's Vincent McCory from Washington, D.C. Hi, Vincent. Thanks for joining me. Tell us, talk to me about the status of the elections. Where do things stand right now?
You know, at the moment, the fact is that it's not clear yet who is going to take control of the House or even the Senate. There are a number of races that are yet to be decided, including the congressional races across the country. The Republican Party is leading at the moment the House race with at least 209 seats. They need 218 to control. But the Democratic Party is right close behind with at least over 179, and with about 40 or so races not decided, that number will definitely reduce very significantly. What that means is that even if the Republican Party takes control of the House, it will be with a very narrow majority. Now, that will not enable them to completely derail the agenda of President Joe Biden for the next 2 years. It will mean that the two parties will find ways to work together in some of the areas because none of them can outrightly you determine the agenda for the next 2 years. That's totally the opposite of what they had expected. There was a prediction of a red wave across the country. That did not happen, to the disappointment of the Republican Party. When it comes to the Senate vote, the Senate control, it looks like the two seats in Nevada and of course Georgia are going to be a great determinant as to who will control the Senate. It might end up again being under the control of the Democratic Party, again with a narrow majority. So as things stand now, it is not yet decided. Things are still in limbo as far as control of the House and the Senate is concerned.
For you, what would you say were perhaps the important things that drove Americans to the polls?
You see, the different Americans were driven to the polls by different issues. But first and foremost, the top was the economy. Most Americans talked about us, hurting at this moment because of the global economic crunch. We've seen inflation rates extremely high in the United States. The U.S. Fed has been trying to work hard to bring down that inflation. So that drove people to the polls, and especially the Republicans who have given President Joe Biden, along with some Democrats, some really poor rating when it comes to the way he has handled the economy. But we know that some of these issues are way beyond the borders of this country. It's a global phenomenon. But as it happens, of course, the president in power gets to be blamed for when things don't go well. Now, for a great number of the Democratic supporters, they were driven in droves to the polling stations by the issue of abortion rights. We know that the Supreme Court struck down the constitutional provided a right to abortion. And that, of course, infuriated many Democrats across the country. That is believed to have driven a majority of them to the polls to make a point. And also, there's the issue of security and gun rights. Those are some of the issues that really, drove people to the polls. And perhaps the voting patterns, when it gets to be studied, will show who of those people really carried the day. And it looks like the Democratic Party really held on to the seats that they have, which means their messaging resonated more with a great number of Americans, because typically in the midterms, the ruling party, the party in power, loses a lot especially in the congressional seats. But at the moment, as we speak, the Democratic Party seems to be sitting quite comfortable, even despite a loss, despite a potential, of course, loss of the speakership in the House. That still gives them, a reason to feel confident for the next 2 years, and even looking up to the presidential election in 2 years.
So perhaps those were some of the surprises in the elections. But talk to us about those in the camp of former President Donald Trump, and Donald Trump himself, and the likely decision he might be making ahead of, 2024.
Well, many wanted to believe that President Donald Trump is going to have a very, very significant impact in this election by pretty much winning in the races that he endorsed. He endorsed a number of the Republican contenders. But as it turned out, they did not perform. Not all of them performed as greatly as they did. Now, some are reading into this as a sign that this does not augur well, or does not bode well for him, as he kind of seems to be getting closer and closer to announcing that he's going to run for the 2024 elections. So if this race is anything to go by, while he has huge support within the Republican Party still, the results of this election did not necessarily make that statement in terms of how influential he is when it comes to certain key issues. It looks like some of the voters did not necessarily, go with his message. And therefore, some of the people he endorsed actually lost the elections, and the Republican Party did not perform as he himself had wished. In fact, right now he's saying he doesn't want to be blamed for the losses that the Republican Party has incurred. So that means that while he remains extremely popular, he may face a few challenges when it comes to the upcoming presidential election in 2 years.
So, Vincent, while the wait continues, we'll be touching base with you a little later. Thank you for talking to us.
It's a pleasure.
UA's Vincent McCory joining us there from Washington. We'll move away from the United States to China and health. Now, the country has slightly relaxed some of its COVID restrictions, even as case numbers rise to their highest levels in months. Quarantine for close contacts will be cut from 7 days in a state facility to 5 and 3 days at home. Officials will also stop recording secondary contacts, meaning many people will avoid having to quarantine. The slight easing comes weeks after President Xi Jinping was reinstated as party leader for a historic third term. Mr. Xi held his first COVID meeting with his newly elected standing committee yesterday. China's zero COVID policy has saved lives in the country of 1.4 billion people, but also dealt a punishing blow to the economy and ordinary people's lives. Leaders of Southeast Asian nations have held informal talks at a retreat session in Cambodia as part of the 40th and 41st Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summits. Cambodian Prime Minister and Asian host Hun Sen, also as well as representatives from other countries in the bloc, Brunei, Laos, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam were present at the meeting in Phnom Penh. Meetings at the summit are expected to be dominated by Myanmar's escalating violence and political gridlock, with increasingly frustrated members of the group struggling to get the country's junta to comply with an agreed peace plan. Well, speaking of Myanmar, Fortify Rights, an independent non-profit organization, has slammed the Association of Southeast Asian Nations for its abject failure of leadership in dealing with the conflict in the country. Patrick von Sathorn, an official at Fortify Rights, says ASEAN should suspend Myanmar's participation throughout the bloc so the junta cannot continue to stymie any progress towards peace. ASEAN, which has barred Myanmar's junta leaders from its meetings since last year, repeated its commitment to the so-called five-point peace consensus, but some members have been pushing for a stronger stance.
This document that Fortify Rights published shows an abject failure of leadership on the part of ASEAN to deal with what's happening in Myanmar. It proposes to stick with the status quo with regard to the junta's participation in all ASEAN meetings apart from summits and foreign ministers' meetings. So we think that the least that ASEAN can do at this point is suspend the junta's participation throughout the entire ASEAN system due to the ongoing crimes against humanity committed by the junta against its own people. I mean, what it means is that they can continue to be part of the conversation in terms of how to actually deal with the crisis. But they are the root cause of the crisis. So how can they be part of the solution? I mean, this week, Justice for Myanmar, another advocacy group, uncovered that Myanmar will be leading the Air Force coordination meetings within ASEAN. And that's all whilst the junta's Air Force is indiscriminately bombing civilian populations throughout the country. This is really unacceptable. How can ASEAN continue to allow this murderous junta to continue to be part of this bloc?
The German government has blocked another deal between a chip maker in that country and a Chinese buyer. That's the second this week alone. And these moves just come a week after Chancellor Olaf Scholz helmed a state visit that many viewed as a trade visit to China. Well, to talk to us more about the situation is Cassandra Sunt, a Deutsche Welle correspondent from Berlin. Hi, Cassandra. Tell us a little more about these two companies and what they signal about relations between Germany and China.
Well, one of the companies involved is called Elmos, and the site in question is in Western Germany, where they make those chips. This isn't cutting-edge technology, but these chips could be used in cars and medical equipment. And that deal to sell the chip-making site to a Swedish company that's a subsidiary of a Chinese company, it's all a little bit complicated, but it had been in the works since last year. And it did look like it was going to go through until this week, when the economy ministry came out and said that they were going to block the deal. Meanwhile, the second company affected was another chip maker called ERS Electronics in the south of Germany, and that deal was less formed and looked like it was going to involve Chinese investment, but now the government has come out and nixed it. This is all occurring in the wake of a controversial sale of a stake in a Hamburg port terminal to a Chinese company. None of these are earth-shattering deals, but these two blocks this week reflect a greater scrutiny from the German side about what kind of deals are really win-win right now. Economy Minister Robert Habeck said that while Germany remains open to investment, quote, "we are not naive either."
And Cassandra, critics have said the deals were potential security risks, but there's also a fear that Germany might become too dependent on China. Now, is that a real risk?
In the long term, it's possible. China is Germany's largest trading partner, with about 9.5% of its trade with China. But almost directly following China on that trading partner list are countries like the U.S., France, and Poland, who represent between 5 and 8% of trade each. So it's a pretty diverse portfolio. Compare that to Australia, Nigeria, and South Korea, who are much more dependent on Chinese trade. Those countries have between 20 and 30% of their trade with China. So at the moment, Germany still has more space for geopolitical maneuvering.
Blocked chip deals come amid a worldwide shortage. What does this tell us about the EU and also Germany's plans to bring all key production in Europe?
So Chancellor Scholz took a lot of heat domestically for his trip to Beijing last week. Critics feared that the trip and meeting between Scholz and Chinese leaders would be spun by the Communist Party there. But he was pretty firm, even during the press conference afterwards, that this was not going to be business as usual. So his coalition blocking these deals may be part of him walking the walk after this one-day meeting in Beijing, that moving forward, it's not going to be business as usual. And you're right, the deal comes as the European Union is trying to lure more of these companies and keep the EU's existing microchip and semiconductor companies in business. Just this year, the EU unveiled an over 40 billion euro plan to help support the industry within the bloc. That's because these kinds of chips are critical to all sorts of consumer products, anything from gaming consoles to automobiles. So this reevaluation of foreign investment in German companies comes as Germany and Europe have learned some hard lessons over the last 2 years about the fragility of critical supply chains.
Thanks, Deutsche Welle correspondent Cassandra Sunt joining us there from Berlin. We'll move on to other stories. A large earthquake hit Tonga today, triggering a tsunami warning and an immediate evacuation order from the government of the island nation. The government initially asked locals to flee to high ground following what it said was a 7.9 magnitude earthquake originating near the town of Naifu on the island of Vavu, before downgrading the alert and urging the public to take special caution. According to a government statement, due to the tsunami wave being less than 1 foot, it is expected that these tsunami waves will only affect coastlines at the point in time. However, they are warning that ocean currents around marine coastal areas may be strong and erratic, and special caution should be exercised. Staying with the climate, Pakistan will not be satisfied unless UN Climate Summit's negotiators unlock emergency cash for the country to rebuild after this year's devastating floods. That's according to its climate minister, Sherry Rahman, on on the sidelines of the COP27 summit in Egypt. She laments the glacial pace of climate diplomacy, saying that it cannot meet the needs of a country struggling to recover from climate-fueled flooding that caused more than $30 billion in economic losses.
What goes on in Pakistan won't stay in Pakistan. We don't wish for it to be that way. But the dystopia has already come to our doorsteps, right? It's on my doorstep. And I am able to build a buffer around my house. Others are not. It is still, the water still came right through my roof. There no amount of buffer can say, other than you living in a bunker, you can't stop that amount of torrential, flash flooding from the sky. You just can't. We've never seen it before. I hope we won't see it again. But the COP27 has to offer us a plan beyond hope. The scientific advances or the political advances we make here will have very little meaning on the ground unless there is a transfer of resources that shifts the needle on how people face the future and how they can adapt to what seems to be a 3-degree future hurtling straight at us.
Staying with the impact of climate change over in Somalia, it's been blighted by the longest, most severe drought in 40 years, which is expected to continue well into next year. The UN says around half of the population, 7.8 million people, need urgent humanitarian assistance. Millions are on the brink of starvation. Available resources are struggling to keep pace with escalating needs. Visiting the Kabasa internally displaced persons camp in Dulo, Somalia, the head of the United Nations Population Fund, Natalia Cannon, said 2 million women, adolescent girls of childbearing age are going hungry because of unprecedented drought. They are also facing a daily struggle to survive and are caught in a double crisis of violence and hunger.
I'm here in Somalia visiting a place called Dalo. In this town, people are streaming across the bridge behind me, which separates Somalia from Ethiopia. The level of desperation, knowing that almost 2 million women and adolescent girls of childbearing age are going hungry because of unprecedented drought not seen in decades in this country. The consequences of hunger when you're pregnant, when the newborn arrives, cannot be understated. It is a devastating situation, and UNFPA has done its best to deploy resources to work with women of this community and the male leaders to assure that there will be safe spaces for women and girls to be protected from gender-based violence and to provide what we call dignity kits, because we're talking about human dignity when you're menstruating and you're an internally displaced woman or girl fleeing the situation of potential famine. So here we are in Kabasa camp. The message is that the need is urgent because as much as UNFPA is doing, the demand is growing. We really need more resources to be able to register these women and their children, to be able to provide the dignity kits that they need if they're pregnant, and also the mobile clinics that we are fundraising for. And I'm pretty confident that international solidarity, the government, and the people of this community will be able to make a difference at this really, really desperate time. She's a girl. Yeah.
Staying with humanitarian assistance, the United Nations has overwhelmingly passed a drafted resolution calling out the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan and setting the stage for increased aid there. The withdrawal of U.S.-led forces from Afghanistan, completed a minute before midnight, August 30, 2021, came as the Taliban swept to power after a 20-year insurgency with a speed and ease that took the world by surprise. Since taking control, the Islamist Taliban have said women should not leave home without a male relative and must cover their faces, though some women in urban centres ignore the rule. Some women have been permitted to work in government offices. The group also made a U-turn on signals it would open all girls' high school in March. Finally on the programme, French fashion label Christian Dior has kicked off the holiday shopping season in London, unveiling a Christmas spectacle at Harrods, with tennis star Emma Raducanu presiding over the event. The LVMH-owned brand outlined the London department store's facade with lights emblazoning the entrance with an enormous star and filling the windows with sugar sculptures and merchandise. The elaborate holiday setup comes as the luxury sector grows strongly, with wealthy locals, deep-pocketed tourists splashing out on designer fashion despite soaring prices.
I didn't get nervous because it's similar to playing in front of a big stage and playing a night match because it's at dark. I love the atmosphere, but yeah, it was amazing to see the turnout and the support for such an amazing exhibition. I think that it's never been done before to take over all of the shop windows here at Harrods, so yeah, just a testament to Dior's great work.
We will, turn down the light at a certain moment in the night as every store. I think we contribute like that to saving some energy. But our job is to give emotion to joy to people. Dior is about dream, and dream in Dior is our motto as a company. And I believe that what we can do, very modestly, is to give a moment of pleasure to people even in these difficult times.
Really, for Harrods, we're atypical. We focus on the really ultra-high net worth individuals, and they haven't really been hit by the crisis. We feel desperately sorry for those people who are being hit, but our marketplace has been focused on that top 0.1% of the world, and that's always been absolutely inelastic.
That's our programme this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Alessandra Walker. Bye for now.